how does it sound?
Okay. Want to talk?
Sure. How does it sound?
Count to 10 and I'll rewind it.
Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 King, 2 King, 1 Chronicles, 2 Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Job, Songs of Solomon. Now, you carry on from there.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Great, good. Yeah.
The idea of making the film with veterans of the strike was a part of the original conception, even before either you or I were employed. That is evidenced by the fact that a sample was made by Vera Roney, and who else made that first sample?
I think she did it with Bob, right?
Bob who? Corstead?
No. Didn't you do it with the
No, this was before Bob Spencer ever came on.
Okay.
No, ever before I was hired. Or
I think she did it with that woman in Atlanta.
We have a copy of it. It's on the you got the
I got the list.
Okay. Well, it's that one sampler that was made in 1987.
Okay.
And it's Eula McGill. Saul Staton, whom I didn't put on your list. I forgot he was there. Jackie Hall. Lloyd Gossett. That young black organizer, what was her name? Whom we never saw again.
The woman that we then interviewed ourselves? No.
I don't think we ever.
Oh no, I don't know.
But there were 5 or 6 people on that tape, and they talked about the strike. And as I say, there were 4 veterans of the strike, and there was Saul Staton, there was Eula McGill, there was Lloyd Gossett. Maybe there were only those 3, and then Jackie Hall, an historian, and this labor organizer was talking about how the ghost of the strike had inhibited organization. So right from the beginning, the idea of having veterans of the strike talk about it was a part of the idea. In the original proposal, which Bob Spencer and I developed, we budgeted for workshops to be put on by Textile Workers Union locals. And I made a presentation and Vera made a presentation at a regional meeting of the TWA in outside of Washington.
TWA or Act 2?
Act 2, I'm sorry. Act 2, sorry. Thank you. In maybe 1987 or 88. 88 maybe. I don't need to record how disastrous that presentation was. But,
well, why was it disastrous? I mean, what were the elements that were missing? And could you move maybe you just lean forward. That'd be great.
The things that were missing was that we had a large group. The veterans were only a small part of it. The session was dominated by the formula of all such meetings, which was that a few leaders are at the front and everybody else kind of nods their heads. And then Vera made a presentation which was so full of her anger at the South that I found myself bristling, and I think I said publicly as well as privately, this is not an anti-South film. I realized right at that moment that Vera should not go out on these jobs with me, because that wasn't the attitude that we wanted. And I said so. I didn't tell her that bluntly, but I certainly said that to the group, this is not an anti-South film. At that point, there was no talk about race. We just assumed that it was not a subject matter that had any racial overtone, particularly.
Because
they were very few of the blacks were allowed to work in the mills. Very few of none of the archives we had showed any blacks. We had no record of them taking any part in the strike. So, as far as we were concerned, it was a white story. But I think the point is that right from the very beginning, the idea of making the film with people was to be the method. And also, when I came back, and I think this can be documented, and if Vera has them, or we may have them somewhere in the files, my letter, you see, remember that in the summer of '88, I made a tour with Kazimierski, who was a colleague at NYU and a very fine photographer, who had made a film called Hard Choices with some other people at NYU about a community in the Rust Belt outside of Pittsburgh that had lost its factory and fallen into decline.
That was the American Can Company, I think.
The American Can Company simply gave a grant to NYU, but it had nothing to do with them otherwise. But this was a very strong film, and I at the time thought, well, I could get some of my colleagues and give them Kazimierski needs another film because he's going to be coming up for tenure, and I could get him to work on it. And so he and I made this tour, and he took pictures. We have a number of the pictures
they're beautiful.
At the time. And I came back. The first thing I realized was this was not a film that could just be made with anybody. That the relationship between the filmmakers and the people who were going to be testifying had to be one of very special understanding. And while Kazimierski had this in the film he made in outside of Pittsburgh, because it happened to be a Polish town and he could speak Polish and all of that, he didn't have the same relationship in the South. It wasn't antagonistic, but he was outside of it. And I, at that time, thought that mattered a lot more than it turned out to be later on.
You thought that the antagonism would matter too much.
I thought that being Southern was very important part of being a part of this the crew. And I didn't realize how wrong I was. The other thing was that when I came back, I said, don't make the film. Because I said that most people don't want to talk about it, they don't want to think about it, it's old hat, the labor people are not keen to be reminded of one more defeat. The people who were against the strike, who were involved but had turned against the idea. And principally, I think, and I believe you'll find that in the letter, that to try to get from ailing old people an account of a time when they were young and vigorous and had fire in their belly was almost a contradiction in terms. So if labor doesn't want, the union organizers don't want one more film to remind them of a defeat, if these old people don't want to talk about it, why make the film? I think the only thing that kept me going was that Vera was so strong in wanting to make the film. By that time, I had gotten Bob Spencer involved because he was a former student who had worked on labor films, raising money for labor films, had raised a lot of money, and we needed somebody who could help us raise money. Wanted very much to get involved with a big project and was willing to take on the job of helping to raise money. And I had a sabbatical coming up, and I was going to go to Brazil, and I was going to be out of the country for a long time. And so that's why we persevered. And Bob Spencer then wrote all those grants to the Southern State Humanities Councils, using the Vera's contacts with these mostly Southern historians to get them involved and get their backing. We never would have gotten the $44,000 we got from 4 of the 5 Southern State Humanities Councils we applied to if Vera hadn't done the groundwork. But we wouldn't have gotten it if Bob hadn't written those grants very skillfully and hadn't been on the backs of all of those people to write letters, etc., etc. But I think what we're talking about is the big thing is making a film with people rather than about them. And that, I think it's simpler to say in 2 sentences. The idea was made right from the beginning. Part of that was because that was our conviction, and partly because it was the style of the time.
What do you mean by the style of the time?
In the late 80s, people were doing this kind of thing. And so it's a reflection of the time when it was conceived. The technology, the techniques that we used later on to get witnesses came because of Judy's participation and some luck. I think, Judy, that the first time we used documents to get people involved was when?
Wow.
That is, we knew from Like a Family that there were all these letters that had been written by people, and
Like a Family is
Like a Family is
the publication.
is the book. The making
Like
of
a Family is Jackie Hall and Company's groundbreaking book about the creation of a cotton mill world,
right.
Cotton mill culture. The last chapter, last section, is about the 34 strike. It's a very strong section, but significantly they said, and this is something that we even might put in our text, they said that because of people's reluctance to talk about it, the chapter was built primarily out of documents of the time, newspaper accounts, plus the letters that they found in the archive. Well, I don't know whether Judy and I made this explicit or not, but we both knew that you can't just use letters. Ken's burned to the contrary notwithstanding. You don't have Matthew Brady documenting the strike. You can't use just the letters. You got to have people.
But and more than that, well,
Yeah.
well, first of all, I think that they touched on the ambivalence, and people's reticence to speak. Vera clearly said there's a ghost of the past that is thwarting people's ability to say, yes, I want to be in the Union.
By the way, Judy, we can actually quote, and this is what you want, we can actually quote from that first 1987 film, sample tape, in which this black woman organizer says just that. There's a nice little sentence she's got there that describes that.
But I think that we realized that had to be, that couldn't be a reason for not telling the story in a way, that had to be the subtext to the story. I'm not sure if that was something that was...
We knew that so strongly by 91. Is it I wish...
Well, 91...
You don't have that list that I sent you?
Oh, of the tapes?
Yeah.
Oh, no, I don't. I was just going to go with that to find the tapes. Yeah. Would that help?
Well, it's only that in there we have that... there's a listing of a tape that has 5 sections in it. 5 sections from the film.
Right.
And let me break off just a moment. That tape is marvelous. The first section, we use it as a fundraiser. The first section is about fear. And it's better than anything in the film. The second section...
Is this 91 or was it late? It must have been later.
That's what I was wondering. It may have been 93.
It's got to be later, George, because you know what?
It's 93.
A lot of the material is what is already in the movie.
Yeah, 93, I guess. But it's the second section is the making of a cotton mill world. It starts with Open Michael's talking about coming from the country and ending with the Cobb story. So it was 93. The third section is the role of the blacks, ending with Bruce Graham.
Right.
The fourth section is about the strike and the flying squadrons. And the fifth section is about Hunyapath. And the Hunyapath is particularly poignant, and I think quite as strong as anything that's done in the film, and it was before you ever met Sue Hill. It's interesting so that was by 93, sorry. But back to the first document. Judy, when did you start using the letters that you had from people to confront people and say, look, this is your...
I think
was
probably
it
91.
Was it when we first met, the first clear memory was when we first met the Rainwater Sisters.
1 second though. How did Judy get involved in the making of the film?
Oh.
We haven't talked about that yet. So I just don't know when you came on, because there was this initial
I came
process.
on in we made an agreement that I would come on like March 11th, 1990.
Was it?
The infamous hospital bed scene.
Well, yeah, yeah.
I didn't realize it was that early in the year.
It was March 1990, February maybe.
Yeah. Well, you know when your operation was.
My operation was March 13th.
Was it before or after the operation?
Before.
Was it?
Before. No. We talked, and
Yeah.
you invited me to come onto the film before the operation.
But I delivered all the documents.
After the not all the documents. You delivered the 350-page doctoral thesis and Like a Family to my hospital bed about 3 days after my hysterectomy.
Okay.
It was the greatest thing you could have done.
So talk about callowness.
No, the best line though, George, is, and this will go down in history somewhere, when you said, I called you up and I said, George, I have cancer due to DS exposure. I'm going to have this radical hysterectomy, and I don't know what my life is going to look like, but I just wanted you to hear it from me. And you said, well, when is your hysterectomy? And I said, it's March 13th. I think it's 4 days. And you said, March 13th. will you be better by June 1st? I said, I don't know, George. And you said, well, I said, I'm going to go, I think I'm going to go down to like Martha's Vineyard and get someone to lend me a house so I could sit on the beach and meditate and become macrobiotic and do a lot of yoga and heal. And you said, oh, you don't want to do that. And then you said, I'm working on this film about textile workers and I'm having trouble getting them to talk. I think you could help open them up. Why don't you work on this film? So that's how I got involved.
But I'm also sure that I was thinking about your work on documents and photographs from the Evo Institute.
The first time that we used any archival material to elicit discussion was the very first summer in 1990, because we were using the archival footage.
Then that's when we met the Rainwater Sisters.
That's right. That's when we met the Rainwater Sisters.
When we went to Noonan.
Right.
And we had the names from the Atlanta papers. We had the fact that the
right.
raid had taken place. We had some names.
Well, we got the names a little later, but in terms of Noonan, what we did, I mean, it was we did have the newspapers, and in Noonan I called because I knew that 126 pickets had been interned in that camp, and we knew a lot of that from the archival footage itself. I called up the local police office and asked if they had any records from 1934, thinking that all these people were arrested, and they said, honey, we don't keep records like that. And anyway, that probably would be with the National Guard, but there is a guy that's from that town if you want to talk to him. So then they put on the bondsman, and the bondsman, I told the bondsman that we wanted to talk to people from Noonan who worked in the cotton mills, and he gave me a long list of names, and the first name was Opal McMichael, and the second name was the Rainwater Sisters, and that's when we started. I mean, we showed Opal McMichael the archival footage of Noonan, and she couldn't recognize anybody, and she sent us over to the Rainwater Sisters.
So, just so I can place this, Noonan is the first place that the two of you go down to as a team and you start working.
No, we went to Atlanta first.
Right.
Atlanta
In fact,
first.
we didn't.
And the first interviews were done with Lloyd Gossett.
Okay.
The very first, and then we went to Columbus, Georgia, and
this is also using things like letters and
No,
newsreels?
no.
No,
We're
we
not.
weren't doing that then.
we were only using the newsreels then, and we didn't have any newsreels really of. I believe we showed Lloyd Gossett the footage from Atlanta, from Noonan. We interviewed Joe Jacobs at that time too. We didn't have any documents or anything like that at that point, but we did interview Joe Jacobs, and we didn't go to Noonan until I think a little bit later. I mean, I think we went a little bit later that summer.
That's in 1990?
Yeah.
We're talking about 1990?
Yeah.
Oh, that's...
So this is the stoning method.
89, 90. Where is that? Huh.
Can you take it and put it in? And after you-
When did you say that first?
We went out, I think, in July of 90, possibly right after July 4th.
Let's see. I saw Ryan jail in the 16th.
I went with you.
You didn't go to jail.
I did.
Did you?
Mm-hmm.
Because I went to the Johnny Popham weekend that time. Let's see, then worked with Cliff Kuhn on the 14th. David Carlton and Vanderbilt before that. Pat Burton.
Well, we remember the big chunks. We could sort of, I guess, fix the dates afterwards.
We see. I saw you on May the 29th. We spent the evening together then. That's in 1990. Let's see.
Yeah, and you saw me on June 28th, I think.
Cindy Rossiter. Sally Alvarez.
That was a very difficult time that summer for one reason, which George, we knew who the big players were. I mean, we knew Lloyd Gossett, we knew Joe Jacobs, we knew about Eula McGill, but we didn't know about the people who didn't stay as staunch trade unionists. And how to find them was quite an issue.
So even people, say, within the community who were still physically there, but who were not...
Well, the people who were, physically there, I mean, we couldn't know who had been involved in the strike and who wasn't involved in the strike. We didn't really have any proper names. We weren't using the letters that summer. So it was very, very frustrating because we knew who the big players were, but the big players weren't involved in the cotton mill communities anymore.
Right.
They lived around the mill. I mean, they didn't live around the mill for the most part. They didn't live in those communities anymore. So if you went back to the community, how were you going to find these people that had been involved? Because the issue started to become clear that if they were really involved, they'd be either blacklisted or they became sort of staunch trade unionists, and they were really out, and there's only a handful of those.
So where was the other half?
Right, so where was everybody?
So then what did that lead you both to do from that point
Well,
on?
that summer was a little bit difficult. I mean, we often would, George, and often when we would find people, I mean, so we were relying on, talking to, a cotton mill worker, or talking to a retiree, or talking to someone from the union who knew somebody, and we make sort of an entree into the community that way. But it was very, very hard to find people who could really talk about the strike sort of in some kind of detail, who were from some of these towns who, either they were dead, or they were either dead, or they they didn't remember anything, or
So now you're talking about once you've gone through this multiple indirect process of somebody suggesting this person is suggesting this person, then you come in contact with
we would
them.
always go through the newspapers and
Right.
look for proper names.
Right.
I mean, I think that pretty much was a given.
Okay.
Boy, it's just, when I think about all this work every single day and how I did not keep a really good diary, it is just, it unhinges me.
Don't worry about
I mean, we had all these newspapers. George, do you want to, I mean, that summer we learned, I mean, maybe the way that we want to construct this is, how did we learn some of the lessons that we were learning that helped us make the choices that we were making?
Mm-hmm.
Because I think every summer, to some extent, we
Well, it's
probably
a
learned
progression towards
something.
something.
Right.
So from that summer, and that sort of frustrating summer from what it sounds like, what led you to the next step in terms of how
Well,
you were going to approach the
we-
or
Yeah, we should finish that summer, I guess. What are you coming up with?
Oh, it's just all kinds of things. The funny thing, I can't. When would you say your operation was?
March 13th.
That didn't even make my diary.
That was my operation. Does it make your diary that you came to visit me? Check 15th or 16th.
The 15th. No, that sent the NIH presentation on Federal Express.
Okay, I'm in there.
Well, yeah.
Okay.
Pohi, the broadcast about Pohi was on NPR that Friday. Yeah, here it is. To Columbia Presbyterian Hospital to see Judy Helfand. That's on the 16th. It's documented.
There, you did
Well,
it.
and on the 17th, income tax.
Yeah, your income taxes were a lot easier then, George. It was before Uprising of 34.
Okay, so that's
All right. Well, so you visited me and you
Yeah.
deposited those big
Okay.
books. Um,
summer 90.
okay.
trip south with Bob Spencer, with Kazimirski, and I remember meeting in Durham with her and her academic advisor. And then here in April 16th, I went out to Lockport and spent a couple of days with her. God, I did a lot of work. I didn't realize I'd done so much ahead of you, Judy, to no avail. It only comes together when you join the team. Had dinner with you May 1st.
May 1st. And look
Yeah.
at June 28th.
Hmm?
Look at June 28th.
Okay, but May 1st was the first indication here. And that's when we went to, that's when I went, by the way. We split then. I went to, remember I went to Kentucky,
To Apple Shop.
to Apple Shop.
And I went to Boston to some archives.
I went to Knoxville. to see Gavanta.
Oh, you know what it was?
Mm-hmm.
You went up there for that, that's the summer that everyone did that oral history on Miles. Because he died that year, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And that's when you met Lucille Thornburg.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when you decided her memory's not so good.
Mm-hmm.
We shouldn't interview her. And you got her scrapbook, I think.
Well, I didn't
Well,
take
you
it.
found
but I
out
saw
about you
it,
found out about her scrapbook.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's when May the 4th was when I set up the oral history tent at Highland.
Right.
That's right. Mel's funeral, oral history tent, all of that, yeah. Then we went to Knoxville and Charlotte, and met all this involved with public access too. Getting back to Vera. And we did the New York Council of the Arts proposal on May 15th. Remember, we got that.
Yeah.
Presented the grant proposal on the 17th. And then I went to Columbus, Georgia, and worked with Sally Alvarez for a week. You weren't there at that time.
I met Sally later in the summer.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And that's when I went. Remember, we got that old guy who told us the story twice, and then he wouldn't tell us it again.
That's when you met that guy.
Yeah. Amazing.
Now, George, that was actually.
And it Xeroxed all the local newspapers there.
Right. Now, you had thought Columbus would be a big player
That's right.
there.
And Andy, I met Angie Rossiter.
Right.
And her husband, that good-looking woman who was there, and we thought she was going to be our representative young textile worker.
Right.
Remember? Because I thought it had to be told from the standpoint of young people. And I met with John Reese and Bo Ware.
Yeah. Reese Boulware.
Yeah.
Now,
I saw the Georgia Humanities Council, remember, and he took me to Wendy's for lunch. Underline. Went to jail to see Roger and Dow Kirkpatrick. Then we came back to Brookhaven. Was there for the birthday party.
now,
Yeah.
oh. George, that's an interesting point. I mean,
What's that?
well, in the original, what do you see?
Yeah, go ahead.
What were you going to say?
No, I just said I went down to the union meeting, the meeting of the union in Miami. Remember when they had the meeting, and I met a number of other people,
Right.
including some people who we later interviewed. And Eula McGill was there, and I noticed how much she deteriorated since physically, since I saw the sampler in which she appeared, and I was very much worried about that. And saw Saul Stetton there, and was we then went up to Rock Hill, South Carolina. To work with the Sinking Creek Festival. Saw David Carlton there. I would say that by the middle of 1990, we knew that for all of our wonderful cooperation we're getting from all the scholars, they weren't going to do it either.
Did we really know that then? I don't think we knew. I think we decided that later. I think we held out this idea that they were going to come in and...
You're probably right.
I mean, if...
Yeah.
In fact, there was always a conflict, or I don't know if you want to call it a conflict, but there's this sort of dual notion that this would be sort of guided by young textile workers, and there was the feeling that those young textile workers would investigate the history of their parents and grandparents.
Exactly. Wait a minute.
And tell this story.
Okay.
And there was this feeling that it had to be blood. It had to be blood.
That's fine.
When we first went to the regional meeting of Act 2.
Now this is before me.
That's right.
Right. This is
when we first went to it. The idea was that we would introduce to them the idea of having a series of workshops where young textile workers would meet with their parents and get the parents to tell them about the strike. That never happened, and it never worked. We tried it a number of times. I recall, where was it?
Well, we tried it with Angie Rossner in Columbus. Yeah. And we tried it with that nice young man who's actually in the movie for 30 seconds now, in Opelika, Alabama. But the reality was...
And we tried it particularly with that, the woman in, was it Coolamy?
Yeah, the woman in Coolamy.
Where she was head of her local. Right. And her mother...
Her
grandmother was so bitter because the grandmother was married to somebody who had been moved off the line into a supervisor position. So he couldn't go on strike, she thought. And because her husband didn't go on strike, she was called all kinds of names by her neighbors.
Scab.
And 50-some years later, that's all she could remember, was the bitterness she felt towards her neighbors. Now, it's interesting, that's one of the aspects of the 34 strike that we don't really touch on, is how bitter it made one person against another. We got plenty of evidence of that, but somehow it didn't get into the final.
Explicitly.
I think in her case, though, it was a later strike that she was talking about. I don't think she was talking about 34. Which
But
was
the
a-
phenomenon,
but-
the phenomenon of a strike being divisive in a community and pitting one worker against the other was something that we only just hint at. But it was a very real
Well, except
thing.
for a honeypath. I mean, that's not too much of a hint. I mean,
Well, nobody's blaming the strikers for it.
right.
You see, for example, what that woman said about the strikers being the people who were not the best people in the mills and all of that, and we heard that from a number of people. Who else?
But going back to that
Yeah.
point, we had there was a concept that was written into those early proposals that the guides for this movie would be these young textile workers
Yeah, that's right.
who were discovering their own history.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a very it was a good idea, but it was very much based on genetics and biology. You know, it was like these people would find out literally about their parents and their grandparents. And there was this notion that young textile workers must be the children of former textile workers or the grandchildren of other textile workers, and that they were still working, that the family was
Yes,
still
and
doing
we were
that.
looking very much for 3-generation families.
We wanted something perfect.
Yes, that's right, and we
We-
never found it.
And
Of course
also,
not.
also presuming that they had passed on their experiences to their children.
Well, no, we were assuming that they passed on the notion that they should work in a mill, but that they would work in the mill.
Right.
But they didn't pass on this history because that's what they were going after. We were going to train them to go after that history. But, you know, that kind of training and that kind of interviewing, George,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that takes a lot of. That takes some training. I mean, what we wanted them to do and do it on camera was that I think that we hadn't anticipated the level of the kind of workshops and level of training that maybe we really needed to do with them before we ever put them on camera.
Mm-hmm.
So when we put them on camera, you know, they'd ask one question and then we'd have to sort of give them the rest of the, well, why don't you ask them about this and ask them about this? And then they sort of felt like pawns in a scenario, and it was very, it felt a little uncomfortable. But that idea enlarged, became the backbone of the project. Was what do these young people know and what do they not know?
Right.
Why don't they know about it? What does it mean for them to not know their history? How does it affect their economy? How does it affect their ability to say, yes, I want to be in this union, or no, I don't want to be in this union? How does this even color their idea about what a union is? And it really wasn't until 92 that it became really clear, I think, George, that this concept of that the children will rediscover their history, that's a very important concept, but that the children didn't necessarily have to be children of textile workers. They could be children of the region. And that they didn't even have to be textile workers themselves, because it was so clear that the textile industry had such a predominant, it was such a predominant force and had made such an impact on the character of the region and the way, you know, workers were thought of and the way labor was thought of and how labor was treated. That so for me, that happened at I guess it was the 1991 meeting of Grassroots Leadership. But that.
Okay, I would think that the big break in that concept came when Judy had her first meetings with Grassroots Leadership, and she came back full of their responses. Hello? We were talking about the heritage of a region, not just the cotton mill. And when did I start talking with you, Judy, about class?
Well, I mean, between the two of us,
Mm-hmm.
I think that there was always this notion for a while. I mean, for the first, I'd say 90 and summer of 90 and summer of 91, we certainly summer of 90, we often didn't ask in our interviews, we didn't ask them to be real reflective or analytical at times about what
Oh yeah,
was going on
This is
during
neating
this
it up a
strike.
bit, but
That's needing. What is needing?
that is making it neat.
Oh, okay, what we're going to say right
Yeah.
now? Okay.
But it didn't take us too long to realize, and it was right. I can just give you that we couldn't just talk to these people about the strike. There was fear, there was uncertainty. They didn't remember quite which strike it was. It was a blip in their lives. We had to get them to talk about their whole lives in which that fit, and then they began to realize. And it was only in the editing room
Begin to realize what?
began to realize that the strike was important to them. But it was only in the editing room that we realized that was also going to be true of the film. You know, after all, the strike takes up 15 minutes less than 15 minutes of an 87-minute film.
About a strike.
Yeah, less than that. Well, Suzanne helped us with that. But so, for example, and I've told this story so it's a little smooth, if you know what I mean. When we went to the Rainwater Sisters, they recognized Etta Mae Zimmerman in the footage, or they thought they did. And they told me about Etta Mae Zimmerman's father,
Edna Mae.
Etta Mae Zimmerman's father, who was a literate man. He was a lay preacher, and a maverick. He was he would plow with his coat and tie on. He would read the Tom Watson papers. And the Tom Watson papers at that time were radical, though they were also very racist. But having read Van Woodward's groundbreaking book on Tom Watson, which is one of the big, very, very important documents in the whole history of the modern South, I was very much interested in that when they said that Etta Mae Zimmerman's father used to read the Tom Watson papers, and they told a very funny story about him going to the railroad station to take the train to Atlanta, and he'd be so deep in his papers that he wouldn't look up until the train came back from Atlanta. Well, they recognized Etta Mae Zimmerman. Well, so I said, could we call her up from here? I've got a credit card. And they said, yes. I knew that with the advantage to say, we're with the Rainwater Sisters, would you talk with us? And I got Etta Mae on the line. They had told us that Etta Mae was a maiden lady, that she helped them organize the Old Acquaintance Reunion, which was their annual gathering of people who had grown up in the East Noonan Mill. And so we got Etta Mae on the phone, and I said who I was, that we were calling from the Rainwater Sisters, and knowing that I shouldn't ask her immediately about the strike, I said, they tell me that your father used to read the Tom Watson papers. And there was absolute disturbing silence on the other end of the line. And then Etta Mae said, Tom Watson was a socialist. Now I want you to know I'm not a socialist and I'm not interested in talking about that kind of thing. Well, it took me several minutes to talk my way out of that one. But she finally agreed that we should come over. We could come over. And when we got there, she was reluctant at first, but then did tell us, as you'll find in the first tapes, a good bit about the involvement. But there were 2 other women still alive at that time in that community.
Sisters.
What?
Sisters.
2 sisters who were also in the sweep and wouldn't talk with us. And so we knew by that time, this was 1990, wasn't it? Was it?
Yeah,
But we knew by that time that we couldn't just use this material until it was all right to have talked with us about it in Hogansville, where she lived now.
I mean, it wasn't a right to use Etta Mae Zimmerman.
That's right.
If no one else in the town
If no one
would talk
else in
about
the
it.
town. So I said, and I think I'm not prettying it up too much at the time, we've got to court the local historical society, we've got to get to know the librarian, we've got to know other people, we've got to get other people here to talk so that she won't be isolated.
Mm-hmm.
And a year later, we finally got invited to the old acquaintance reunion. In the meantime, Judy had found 2 letters written by Etta Mae's father.
And in this case, it wasn't that difficult because one of the letters had been footnoted in like a family.
Okay.
But what we found that was different. That on top of that, we did find 2 letters. One to Governor Talmadge and one to President Roosevelt.
He had written a letter to Talmadge and a letter to Roosevelt,
Mm-hmm.
in which he had included a copy of his letter to Talmadge, which meant, by the way, he had to. You couldn't Xerox them at the time, so he really. And his letter to Talmadge started off, "Dear Dishonorable Governor," and then about my daughter being thrown in the jail and so forth and so on, the prison. Now the family knew nothing about these letters, so we got copies of those letters made. We got Les Huff from the Georgia Labor Archives to come over to represent us at the old acquaintance reunion. He got up before this group of retired textile workers to explain in great detail the historical value of what we were doing, hardly mentioning the strike. We were all so afraid of mentioning the strike that we were very and we but people were keen by that time, so Huff presented the Zimmerman family with copies of the letters and a certificate for their help in this historic the work of
and a
historical
certificate
form.
recognizing that that Mill Village reunions were incredibly important, and that they themselves were creating an institution that was of historical relevance, and so they were recognizing that.
But we had a crew there covering this reunion, and it was there that we got the Cobb story told. We had recorded it once before in the Rainwater's house, so in the film we've got parts of 2 accounts of it. But dramatically, what happened was that after Etta Mae, we showed part of Etta Mae's testimony. Other people said that they were a part of the thing.
People started,
Yeah,
a number of
yes,
people started
yeah,
to say.
I was
This is
so-
at the reunion.
At
That's
the
a
reunion
reunion,
in a
that's right.
circle. My husband was on that
Yeah.
truck. He almost got pulled in there
Yeah.
too.
And then some bastard from North Carolina got up and he said, "Wait a minute, I come down here to this reunion. I came down to see friends. I didn't come down for no labor business. I want to know what all this pictures you've taken got to do with labor organizing. And suddenly there was an absolute hush over this crowd.
Yeah, he said, are you for it?
Or
are you against it?
Yeah.
Is this a conspiracy?
Good, that's right. A conspiracy, that's right. Your memory is absolutely accurate. And our blood ran cold. I'm sure this is in the footage.
It is in the footage. Well, you see, we were never...
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it's like we turn the camera off and we stop. Because then this other guy stands up and says, look, they're interested in the culture, they're interested in family, they're not interested in this stuff. And then we turn the camera off, so we don't really have any turmoil.
No, this guy...
George, you made us turn the camera off.
This guy was one of those who are chief witnesses before. He said then he was a merchant as well, a small merchant. And then Opal McMichaels got up.
Well, he wasn't really, he was the guy who invited us to the reunion. We never really filmed with him.
No, but we planned to.
We were gonna.
Yeah, because he'd been in the he'd been in the factory, and then he'd had a small store, as of course Opal McMichaels did. And then that was when Opal McMichaels got up and said,
right. Most important thing is, doesn't matter what happened back then.
Yeah.
Most important thing is we love each other because we're family and we love each other, and that's all that matters. And everyone said, "Amen."
And it took us weeks to get anybody else to talk after that. Now did this happen after? Oh yes.
This happened in the summer of '91.
Yeah. But the fascinating thing was that when we first went to Noonan, something happened which showed me immediately Judy's great value. And I think it happened even when we met the Rainwater Sisters.
Are you talking about the teachers?
Yes.
That happened in the summer of '91, right before the old acquaintance reunion.
Okay,
we were back
good.
there for the reunion.
That's right, yeah. Okay, what happened then, '91? We went back to Noonan. We were going to be going to the reunion.
So you have to realize this. So far we interviewed Edna Mae Zimmerman the summer before, and I knew that she was part of this strike. We had interviewed Opal McMichael, and we interviewed the Rainwater Sisters, and we interviewed